The entrepreneurial journey is rarely straightforward. It's unpredictable,
Challenging.
Collaborative.
Risky,
Transformative.
and often deeply personal.
the VentureWell Voices podcast offers an inside look at the changemakers using science and technology to solve the world's greatest challenges. Hear their stories of the messy, meaningful path from idea to impact.
So when you hear Internet of Things, you probably think of your Ring cameras or your smart fridges or a really cool system that turns on all the lights when you get home. But that doesn't really translate to industry where conditions are extreme, like in energy or aerospace or automotive. If you think about a machine that's spinning at 18,000 revs per minute or in temperatures of like 850 degrees Celsius, very expensive cameras going into outer space. We really need the sensors that can handle those environments and be indestructible. And that's where Sensatek comes in. And I have with me Reamonn Soto, the CEO and co-founder of Sensatek. Welcome, Reamonn.
Hey, thank you for having me, Christina. Very excited to be here to share, about our journey and to answer, some of the questions. To just have a conversation, really, about whatever we want to talk about.
Yeah, I hope I did okay trying to explain
Oh
what
yeah,
you do.
you
It's been
did a
a
great
while.
job.
Um,
Yes.
what's your updated one-liner on Sensatek, the more technical one?
All right. So, so Sensatek, we've brought to market, some technologies available, for harsh environments, and one of the ones that we're really excited about is our new cloud-based AI platform that essentially takes videos from a vibrating structure, whether if it's spinning at 80,000 RPM or moving at Mach 5. We're able to help engineers visualize and analyze mechanical motion and vibration, essentially using any video source.
Really cool. Yeah, what I love about that is that it's come such a long way to integrating, what the customer needs. Like I remember being with you in an MIT classroom that had no windows, talking
Right.
about like the blade's heat and vibration. It was very much about the blade at that time. And here we are,
Right.
what is it, like 8 years later? You've really come a long way. You've worked with so many customers. Can you just reflect on that delta, that journey from when you first got started to where you are now?
Well, yeah, that's a really it's very humbling, because when I first started out, just in grad school, in a lab, like I came through the E team stage one while I was still a student, essentially, graduate student at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and it was there where I was working, in the jet engine lab where we had parts that were failing at higher temperatures and no one really knew why, or it wasn't a way to really help, folks really understand and or identify, issues early on so that, you can anticipate it, you can, plan around it, you can, be able to, you know, not encounter so much risk. And so I remember, coming through E-Team to where we first kind of got exposed to like the I-Core process, like the whole lean startup methodology, understanding what it means to like, hey, go out. Okay, you identified a problem, but who else cares about this problem? And I took the curriculum and I really, forced myself to kind of like get out of my comfort zone, get out of the lab, go out there, talk to people who you don't know and really understand the problem space a little better. And then also, it was kind of serendipitous that I had also found a technology that was available for licensing, because I one thing about being a just how I'm wired, you have folks who watch things happen, you got folks who make things happen, then you got those who ask what happened, you know
Mm.
and so I wanted, although I encountered a problem, I also wanted to be a part of the solution. And so I found a technology available for licensing. And it was a technology that could essentially try to detect these issues early on. Um, Problems like with jet engines, blades overheating. And so I found the technology and thought I had the best thing since sliced bread. And I was ready, like, hey, here it is. I got the solution. But I didn't really understand that what the journey, was going to be like, having to like, no, now you have to prove that it works, right? You have to convince them and generate the data, and that's reliable and repeatable and accurate, for the customer to really adopt it. And so that, then kind of got us into the SBIR program, looking at National Science Foundation SBIRs, and some of the other agencies, and just really, understanding what our technical risks were. I mean, putting anything inside of an engine, like that is just, there's a lot of risk, from how do you attach a sensor, to any part, and how do you get it to stay on and collect data reliably? Just so many risks associated with that. And it was an interdisciplinary problem. We had to hire, experts in material science, and also in electrical engineering, and
Mhm.
even in, aero structures, as these things were spinning on blades. I'm going pretty fast. And so then we had to build out a lab. We had to, because a lot of the capabilities that we needed just didn't exist at the time. And so we had to kind of, build and establish our own capabilities. We piggybacked on, test campaigns at Embry-Riddle on actual jet engines and helicopter engines and engines that were on wing, Lear jets. And so that was exciting. That helped us kind of, reduce a lot of our risk. Woodrow Wilson said, "I not only use all the brains that I have, but all that I can borrow." And so we had to go out and, build our team, even like with E-teams and with Aspire, and being able to work with, VentureWell and all of the folks involved, from, of course, you, Christina, to Janine, who was there at the time, and so many others who just really kind of poured into us, and who helped us to really, achieve purpose through so much uncertainty. And
Mhm.
so looking back at that journey, it's like nothing's changed. Like it's like, you learn in writing, they're like, hey, it's so recursive. And I think in innovation, when you have a process that's proven, and it has a track record of success, you're constantly using that process over and over and over. And so we've, rinsed and repeat, from not only, gas turbines used on, in aviation, but we've also expanded to other and explored other markets, like power generation, using aeroderivatives and gas turbines at power plants. So we were able to work with Duke Energy and Siemens Energy, and being able to, commercialize our technology on the actual grid connected turbines.
Mhm.
And then that expanded into other applications like wind energy, where we um, been able to work with, leaders such as, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Constellation Energy, and Invenergy, Next Era Energy Resources, and Florida Power and Light. We've been able to work with industry leaders, and not only, expand our capabilities, but being able to also really understand the problem, and, market, opportunity, in these other different markets. And
Yeah.
so it's like, and when we first started this process, I remember just ICOR, day one, day two, day three, and we're like, look, this process never ends. Like,
Yes.
this is just the beginning, And so, um, it's been quite the journey, but it's like everything comes back full circle. You're always, you get more efficient, in
Yeah.
the process. Um, and so, did I answer the
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, and then
Okay.
some. I wrote down
All right.
a bunch of directions that we can go in. I just a huge
Sure.
plus one to, basically, you said a Woodrow Wilson quote, hire people that are smarter than you.
Oh, yeah.
I love that. That's such a great leadership and management philosophy to take on. Everyone gets better, and you'd always want to hire people smarter than you. So that's great. And you mentioned, you found the patent, and that was just like, that was great, so exciting. You could license it, but there was so much work to do. You could find it, theoretically on the shelf, but you've described all the work that was involved with actually bringing that to market. I think that's kind of a common misconception. Like you have the patent and the technology, that's one component, but there's many other things that need to be done. The team, you mentioned the lab, you mentioned the facilities, the data, the accuracy, the testing, all of that. So can you maybe just briefly reflect on, the when you realized the patent or the license to the patent was just one element of a lot of other work that you had to do?
Yeah, just to just reflecting on that question, I remember, being with my team, and first I realized at some point, like the third year in, I'm like, wow, I'm not the smartest person, at the table here. These
Mhm.
guys, and sometimes you kind of feel like, you have that imposter syndrome a little bit because it's like, wow, you got, folks who have PhDs in electrical engineering, PhDs in material scientists, it's material science. You got one who has a PhD in materials engineering, and everyone
Mhm.
just has like their one person who worked in the industry at an actual engine manufacturer with all these years of experience and worked on sensors you know, on spacecraft. And so you're sitting here like, you're just trying to connect the dots and you're just now you realize, okay, I'm just managing. These are the smart folks in the room. I know the right questions to ask and I just know enough to be dangerous, I guess. But, I think it kind of dawned on me when I realized how challenging this was going to be when I had my university partner in the room with our potential, engine manufacturing partner who had explained like after we had did all of our customer discovery and we realized like, oh, holy moly, we think we have product market fit here. And we had a large, customer at the table with our university partner. And the customer just told them everything that we needed to do in order for them to adopt and basically buy our technology to adopt it into their, their system and their process. And so I was really excited. I'm like, hey guys, look, we got the team here. Everyone's, we're ready to rock and roll. And then as soon as the customer, leaves the room, my university partner, it's just like everything just kind of fell apart. They were like, they're like, oh, well, we need $10 million and we need 10, at least 4 years to do this.
Oh, 4 years.
And I'm like, what do you mean? I thought the sensor was like, can I just take the sensor and just sell it, off the shelf? And I
Wow.
realized like, no, this was just science that was proven. This
Yeah,
wasn't a turnkey product. I really
not a
thought it was
product.
I was naive enough to think that it was turnkey, you know?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I'm like, $10 million in 4 years. I'm like, um, the opportunity is now. So
Yeah, there's no scenario where that works.
right. So the team just kind of like, fell apart a little bit, but we kind of rebuilt, we restructured, and I realized that, okay, dang, I'm going to have to build the technology on my own. I'm going to have to go at it basically alone. I'm the
Mhm.
person boots on the ground. My co-founder, wife, as Rihanna, we basically had to put our, skills together and figure out like how do we duplicate what was in the research paper? How do we duplicate what was in the patent? What
Yeah.
equipment do we need? How do we kind of go out of the, with the resources that we had? And so with the E-team program that helped us, doing stage one, kind of get out there and start talking to people. Then E-team stage two gave us a bit of a budget to like create do like a little bit of prototyping. And we were able to use that essentially, because I told the customers like, yeah, of course, this technology is ready. We got it right now. Let's do it. Right. And so they called our bluff and they actually said, all right, well, we have a campaign coming up. Let's just do a little demo. And
Mhm.
so how soon can you get us sensors? And so we were like overnighting like ovens from like MTI, we were like doing samples and I was cutting ceramics by hand,
Mhm.
um, we're like, well, we're about to find out. Even if I have to super glue the sensor onto, the unit. And so when we did that, we were able to at least, the sensors were ugly, but they worked well enough that they began to see the potential in the technology. And then, we were able to also use that initial case study, use that data to then go out and be competitive towards, and National Science Foundation SBIR phase one that then gave us more money to, really start to build out our capabilities, overcome some of the, more aggressive technical risks that our customers were showing.
But
So
you
go
said
ahead.
about the super glue, right? That's like a classic, like textbook entrepreneurial experience. Like that's the definition of a minimum viable product. Like we're just gonna like get it together, make it work the best we can using whatever materials we have and ship it. And it sounds like it worked.
Yeah, it did. it worked well. Say it worked well enough
Yeah,
to
well
get us
enough.
to get off first base, right?
Yeah.
Of course, I didn't tell the customer it was super glue. I told them what the chemical name for the bonding method, the proprietary bonding method that
Yeah.
we used,
Gorilla
basically,
glue. Yeah. Yes.
right. I was like, yeah, we just engineered this, blah, 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 blah,
Mhm.
this Loctite. But so yeah, it worked well enough. And then, it just, we were able to then, get the phase one, and we're able to start bringing on people who can then help us troubleshoot through some of the other milestones. And then we were able to get our phase two that then allowed us to do some due diligence on like 80 different material systems to find that right combination, that right, mix, of ceramics to, that we can use as an antenna to then wirelessly interrogate sensors that are on things that are high temperature and spinning, pretty fast. And so it was, it was quite the, I mean, I still have, when I think about it, I have some like, PTSD, when it comes to
Mhm.
that, just thinking about like, wow, I can't believe, we did all of that, and then tested it on actual like jet engines, like, you
Yeah.
know, these things that, blades that are designed for nothing to stick on them, and let alone, a sensor. And so, yeah, and I just think about that journey. I mean, I had have a good team, and I remember still hearing you in the back of my, mind when you're looking for the right person on your team. You want to look for people who's kind of already done it before. You want to, and sometimes, there hasn't been things you're doing things that haven't necessarily been done before, but who has that growth mindset, who has achieved purpose through uncertainty, who has kind of been there, who has the war scars that you can also learn from, and so I really think that's really important.
Yeah. And what I always loved about, you is that every time, you look up a picture of you, you're always like in front of a big jet engine. You have a good brand association. But I would love to take it back a little bit to like the beginning and like how you got started on all this. So you obviously were experiencing the problem, firsthand working on those engines. But you have a really interesting background. You were in the Marine Corps. Like, tell us about how your like upbringing and childhood and early experiences all set you up for becoming an entrepreneur and leading this company.
Oh wow. No, memory lane. So I remember, kind of growing up, as a kid. I'm very grateful, for my mother. She was a single mother, raising, three kids essentially, kind of on her own, while going back to school herself, to earn a degree. And so we are on a limited, income just as a college student in general. I mean, now you're doing it with three kids, so you got the stereotypes associated with that that you are also having to kind of overcome. And so resources, weren't really, um, I'm not
Abundant,
gonna,
maybe. Yeah.
right, but when I say that, kind of makes my mom a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. But I'm like, Mom, look, yes, we had a really good childhood. Yes,
Yeah.
we did
It's
great.
tough
We
as a
did not go
parent
without,
to
right?
reflect on your childhood and your kids' childhood. It's weird. I can relate. Yeah.
But I grew up in a household without having McDonald's money, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. And so, so, but still kind of like living in that environment,
Mhm.
and one thing that kind of was like my escape, I think, was like, seeing a space shuttle, kind of take off for the first time when we were living in Florida. And this was like early 90s. And I think that, that kind of sparked my imagination. And then, I remember going to air shows and, hearing those jet engines just kind of roar, from an F-16 that just kind of really like inspired, me in flight. And so while all the kids were outside, playing, I was kind of mostly indoors. I was a nerd, I was inside reading encyclopedias on aviation and designing, aircraft at models, that I was, sketching out of encyclopedias and scaling up um, on tracing paper. And I would wear, this scientist lab coat or whatever that my mom had got at a thrift store. And so, this is who I was, and I was playing Flight Simulator. I was part of the Flight Simulator generation, so I was playing Flight Simulator. I was designing aircraft. I was designing even missile systems. I know that's kind of scary. At 8 years old, I'm designing missile systems because they were in encyclopedia. So I was always kind of into that. But then, in middle school and high school, I struggled in science and math classes. Like I had to take Algebra 1 twice, Algebra 2 twice, failed AP chemistry twice, failed AP biology twice, barely passed geometry. Um, and so I kind of thought, growing up that like not only was not STEM, for me, but I didn't even think college was for me.
Mm,
But there was one thing I was good at that I had an A in, and that was JROTC, Marine Corps JROTC. So
yep.
science, math, really was like it just wasn't like, cooking for me. And so I didn't think college was for me at all. And
Mm,
so I went in, but I remember, September 11th, I know it was yesterday. And I
mm,
remember, being in school, in high
yeah.
school, and, the world had changed. And, you know, at that point, I was like, yeah, I'm still not going to the Marine Corps. The Marines are nuts. I don't think, this stuff is tough. I don't know what I'm going to do, but um, then a recruiter came to me and was like, "Hey, what are you doing after high school?" And I
Yeah.
was like, join the Marine Corps." And, and so I was like, "Why did I say that?" He was like, "Well, what have you done?" It was a mentor too. He was a mentor as well, and someone who I looked up to. And I just thought I had nothing else, so I'd say, "Oh,
Yeah.
I'm joining the Marines." And so he's like, "Well, have you taken any steps? What have you done, to
Yeah.
go in that direction?" And I was like, "Well, I haven't done anything." He's like, "Well, what are you going to do?" I was like, "Well, I guess I'll go ahead and start the process, I'll check it out."
Well,
So joined, I went into the reserves because I promised my mom I would go to college, even though I had no intention. I wasn't sure how that promise was going to be fulfilled. Um, Went into the reserves, and I think the Marines kind of taught me leadership, kind of really instilled, just not being afraid to fail, not being afraid. Like you go in there and they kind of break you down and then build you back up. And after you've
mm,
been broken down for quite a bit, you realize like, oh, okay, it's not so bad. The brokenness isn't so bad after all, because it's in the brokenness where you kind of find, you find some purpose. You find heart. You find out, what you're really made out of. And so for me, I had drill instructors who were just like really tough and just really kind of like nailed me to the cross. And so,
mm,
from that, I was, kind of like resurrected a little bit, just with purpose and learning what leadership's about, learning that leadership requires teamwork, learning how you don't have to do everything on your own, that you can work together, with the people around you, and you can do things that are just unimaginable, things that seem impossible at first, but you can take an impossible situation, and make it very, plausibly possible. And it's that kind of like thinking and that kind of like relentlessness that kind of gets you to try, where innovation starts to happen. It's like, hey, we need to do this. What if we stand on top of each other like a pyramid and, pull the tire over our heads? You start that innovation, that leadership starts to come out. And you're like, oh, that's ridiculous, but I think it'll work.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you realize, like, hey, okay. So then you come out in the civilian world now, and I'm like, wait, I think I might be able to do this. But let me first start off something small. So I started out, I went to college. I started out at a technical school. I got a trade. I was like, oh, okay. All you have to do is really pay attention. You just got to listen.
Mm.
So then,
Listening and showing up is half the work, right?
right, just showing up and just following, the program, and I thought I was doing that in high school. Apparently I wasn't, but maybe I was distracted. I don't know. But so then I started out, I got, did a trade, and then there was a community college next door. And so I'm like, hey, let me go and, I'm going to see what they're talking about,
Mhm.
because I got this thing called a financial aid refund check. And it was like money that, you got reimbursed like after paying for everything. And I was like, oh, wow. Well, what am I going to do with this 400 bucks? you know. So I was like, maybe I can take some more classes. So I went over across the street in the community college, and You know, I took 2 classes for the summer and I buckled down and studied and put a lot of effort into it. And I got 2 A's, in those classes. And I was like, oh man, maybe I can do college. The first 2 years of college was basically almost like a repeat of high school. And so I was like, hey, maybe I can go back, and learn some stuff. But in my mind, I was a college student with a 4.0 GPA. So I chose the hardest major for me, which was physics. And I was like, you know what? I think college is, I kind of applied it like a trade school. I'm like the skill that you get from college for me was learning how to learn. And I figured if I could teach myself how to learn physics, I can apply that skill to just about anything.
I
Um,
love that. Learning how to learn. That is like a perfect summary. And I think you brought that with you into all of the courses we've done together in the accelerator programs.
Absolutely. I think that's the key because you got folks who come in and they think, oh, I got the best thing since sliced bread, and you go out there and customers tell you that your baby is ugly, and or your product is not for them, or you're listening to what they want to, or you have some customers who might be a little bit misleading that say, oh, this is great, oh, this will help solve this big problem, but yeah, but it's not that person's problem.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
how do you discern, what's for you and where's the blue skies and where are the clouds here, and so what story is that really telling? And so, um, that's kind of and so then after undergrad being in marine, being in physics and having opportunities to like intern at national labs and then later on Capitol Hill, just trying to bring those soft skills with those hard skills to be able to like really be a better leader, and not necessarily being out there in the forefront. A lot of times leading is just you're leading processes, you're leading yourself, you're leading your fire team, your 2 or 3 member team, um, and you're leading your teachers, you're
Yeah.
negotiating,
Managing up.
homework, right,
Yeah.
right, exactly. So, um, yeah, it's just been, then going on to grad school and then, being an entrepreneur and, just choosing that path, was, I think, pretty interesting within itself. But all right,
Yeah.
did I answer the question?
Yeah, yeah. I
Okay,
mean, I'm
yeah,
sure your mom is super proud of you now. And thanks for sharing everything that you kind of experienced and love thinking about you, like reading an encyclopedia, wearing a little lab coat. That's really
all right.
sweet. And of course, thank you for your service. It sounds like you got a lot out of that. And all of this kind of came together to make you who you are. And now you're leading a team of 7. You have customers all over the country. Yeah, it's a big deal. You've come a really long way. What's Sensatek on the cusp of now? Like, what's your big focus, or what are you excited about at the company?
Oh man, so what we're really focused on, what we're really excited about, just the future. I know like you see all these startups and you see like, folks in Forbes and you see like Fast Company, and me and my,
Yeah.
co-founder, we always kind of joke about it. We're like, yeah, we chose a startup. Why did we choose startup life? People think that, oh, I'm gonna, this is an opportunity to get some passive income, or this is an opportunity to like really diversify their portfolio. And I want to dabble in it, but they don't know the price that you have to really pay, to actually do it. Like, folks are like, what does it take, to be an entrepreneur? And I tell them like, look, it takes all. It
Yeah.
takes everything you've got. Maxed out credit cards. Taking loans out against the house. When really believe in what you're doing. I mean, these are very uncomfortable, decisions that that have to be made. And so, um, you're seeing, 2 years ago, like when we first started, there was this, you saw Shark Tank, you saw, all these different things that made entrepreneurship look like, it was trendy. It seemed pretty
Hmm.
cool. But then, we went through COVID. Then we went through where there was just a lot of capital just being thrown out there, a lot
Yeah.
of, money. And so then you see other startups now just coming in, raising money at these very high, valuations, and you think you're being smart by saying, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just stay focused and focus on customer traction. And then you find yourself in a valley of death situation where now capital is hard to come by, and you have VCs and you have interest rates that have went up, and now the venture environment just start to like kind of shrink up a bit. And
Mhm.
so you're having tough conversations, and you're having we have to kind of restructure a bit and lay off 80% of our team members and reduce our footprint in our lab and have
Mhm.
uncomfortable conversations with with lenders and and that sort of thing. And so you look at the last 2 years, you're seeing, you have folks who started out with you who are no longer there. You have some folks who started out with you who's gotten acquired. And so, but you notice like, that kind of the mood, it's kind of changed a little bit. There's more uncertainty, in the startup ecosystem. And so
Mhm.
how do you still, achieve purpose? Like I really think leadership is the ability to achieve purpose through uncertainty. So now with all these different headwinds, how do you still look for the silver lining? And it's like, and it's a silver lining that is not just you just see it and it's like, oh, there's a silver lining, but it's like 2 years, spend 2.5 years, that you kind of been navigating this valley of death, where you're just been, really just how do I say this still in friendly terms? You're not scrapping by, but you're just really you're kind of dug in. You're in the trenches, and it's just you're waiting for that next big break, and it just
Mhm.
it just seems like it just doesn't happen. And then a year goes by, then another year goes by, and then you start questioning yourself, am I walking this line? There's a fine line between being relentless and reckless. And so you're like, am I on the relentless side here, or is this do I really need to like,
Yeah.
think differently about, about this whole entrepreneurship thing? But then you look at, your milestones, you look at your KPIs and you realize, well, hey, look, we're still hitting our KPIs. We're still, moving, we're still eating, we haven't gotten a raise, I haven't been able to pay off my credit card debt, but I'm on interest only payments, but those interest only payments are still getting paid.
Yeah.
Lenders, are still, are still working with you. Supporters and folks who've invested in you are still working with you. And so you're like, all right, well, and customers are still, saying, hey, come, take data off of my system, give me insights. Here's a purchase
Yeah.
order. Let's
Can we dig
so
in on that? Can you share a little bit about
sure,
like
yeah.
a customer success story, like in particular, like the impact and how does that keep you going?
Yeah, so what man, that's a really good question. So I think part of like when you're dug in, in the trenches and you're just like, hey, am I maneuvering too much? Am I doing too much? I feel like a scrambling quarterback at times. And then you get a customer like Constellation Energy and Invenergy, and they come in and they had an opportunity to invest in like 12 different companies. And they're like, hey, both of us are gonna invest only in one company and we're going to invest in Sensatek. And one of the things that they said as to why they did that was that you came in and you really sought to understand you understood, you came to learn about how our business works, how we make money, and what our priorities were. And you adapted your solution and your capability around that to help us solve our problem. You weren't
Mhm.
married to the problem that you thought, and even your technology coming in. And so it made me feel like all that gymnastics that I was doing, like customer discovery, customer validation, MVP design development, just kind of, what do you call it? Um, thin slicing the technology in a way to say, hey, did I hear this right? Just kind of spoon feeding it a
Yeah.
little bit. You just start thinking, maybe I'm just doing too much. But then for them to come in and say, we're going to invest in you. And we're going to now, do a paid demonstration across 4 different, power sites. And we're going to start looking at all our other nuclear assets and our oil and gas assets as they just acquired, one of the largest, oil and gas, producers. And so it's like, when you start to see that, and then you see other people then come to the table and do business with you as a result of that, That's the highlight that makes you. I remember when they first told me that, I was like, I was trying to hold back tears, because you're just like back in Marine land, whatever, you're just, it's like artillery just constantly just bombarding you. And you're just like, you're just kind of stuck in your trench. And it's like, where do you go from here? Being able to now have a clear direction where we can tell the rest of the troops, like, hey, we got to run here. Like, hey, it's not going to be easy. There's still, some obstacles here. There's still a lot of risk, but we just got to keep our head down and just, and be smart about it and just keep moving forward, and that gave us an opportunity to get to the next milestone, where we're able to then regroup, rethink, and rededicate. And so what makes me excited now is that having that kind of win, the world of AI is just like, it's a big buzzword right now, but we've been able to leverage the investment, from, these large energy companies we leveraged AI in a way. We found more technology out of the national lab that ended up disrupting our current technology that we had before. And so we licensed it, developed it, built it out, then sliced it to our customers. And they came and said, look, from now on, don't even talk about the other sensor, only talk about this one. And so, oh, and here's a check too. And
Yeah.
so that helped, so we're using now pixels. So we created a video-based measurement system that essentially uses pixels captured from any video camera with principal component analysis and blind source separation. That's our AI, patented AI method that processes high resolution pixel vibration data and automatically separates all of the different pixels into its mode of motion. So what that means is that whether they're using rotating equipment or structures or blades, helicopter blades, hypersonics, they're able to use video that from cameras they already have to generate insights in a much easier, simplified way than having to physically attach something. And we're able to provide those insights like almost instantaneously. And so it's attracted folks, not only our energy customers, but also now Boeing and Lockheed Martin. On the structure side, they're at the table. And so we're really excited about that. We're you know, that's our next trajectory. Because everyone's talking about AI, but we have
Mhm.
patented AI. We're not just using Chat GPT.
Yeah.
We're, you know, I wish I
Yeah, there's
could,
something
but
in there. Yeah, and that's a
right,
great example of like the technology is going to change. The technology is going to advance. You have to just like keep moving on the tech to serve and solve the customer's problems. And you've tuned into that so well that you're not like overly married and blind to the customer need in favor of your technology. So that's like that's like living the responsiveness and the whole idea behind like everything's going to change, lean innovation, technology will catch up and evolve, but as long as you are committed to keeping your finger on the pulse of what your customers need, you'll be good. So
right.
that's how I think you've been able to kind of get through those hard times that you've had over the years. Um, it's a lot, Ramon. There's a lot there. Yeah. So in
Thank you.
my last few minutes here, I guess, w- with all of this, what do you do to take care of yourself?
Oh man, so what do I do to take care of myself? Oh, that's a good question. So, um, you know, what I do to take care of myself, I can always commit like learning. When I feel like I'm
Mhm.
learning, because when things start to feel like they're kind of routine, they kind of start to become you can get stagnant. And so one of the things that I started doing is I pursue um executive education. And so,
Okay.
I'm in the master's program, in finance, at, Harvard University's graduate extension school. And so that now allows me to, further build on what I'm doing with Sensatek. So like, for instance, in my corporate finance class, my professor was like a past CFO at one of Honeywell's divisions. And
Mm.
so I was able, as a part of my project in class, I had to determine what the net present value and the internal rate of return of our technology would be to a
Oh,
large, engine manufacturer.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so I had to brief the presidents of like Siemens, Africa, North America, South America, and all in the same room. And I had to basically brief them on, what the internal rate of return or the net present value of adopting our technology into their
Yeah,
fleet, what it would mean. But my CFO, Honeywell CFO professor, helped me prepare and graded me, for my paper, and I was prepared for that brief. And
that's
so
funny.
being able to still work with, pursue, some education to kind of help, complement, what I'm doing, in the field, that's kind of helped me to, keep, stay sharp and not get stagnant. Also exercising, I started working out a little bit more. I've been
Good
whenever
for
I
you.
can, and I also coach baseball for my 6-year-old.
Oh,
So that really, if you're not sure if you are a leader, go coach a bunch of 6 to 8-year-olds. They'll bring it out of you. You'll start realizing, hey, I didn't realize I think like that. Oh wow, I
yeah.
guess you're encouraging six year
Running around
olds. You're
with
like,
bats. Yeah, and trying to get them to
right,
listen to you. Yeah.
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 That's been helpful. And then of course, my wife and I, we're very, active, in our church community. And like it's been a lot of prayers, a lot of support. And that's kind of helped us to really kind of, remind us, what faith is about and how important it is, even if you can't see it coming, but to still, just have faith and keep sowing, keep investing, keep planting those seeds and what you believe in. And so that's kind of, been helpful.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. It's I've learned a lot from you over the years, and I learned a lot just from this conversation. Really admire you and your work and your leadership. I think that was sort of the theme of what came out of this. There's a lot of ways you could be a great leader, and always staying in learning mode is, I think, the key to that, and how you've become so successful. So thank you for sharing all this with me, and give my best to the family as well.
Hey, will do. And thank you, Christina, for the opportunity. And just thank you for all the support that you provide and continue to provide. So I really appreciate you and appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you
Yeah.
for your leadership.
Thank you. That's so sweet. I know we've known each other for a long time, but I am excited to see where you keep going. I know this is just the beginning.
Thank you.